We are now focusing on West Asia as Syrian ground forces close in to Raqqa, the de facto capital of Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State. The United States and its allies have once again escalated matters by threatening Syria of consequences. They have warned President Bashar al-Assad and his benefactors, namely Russia and Iran, against a potential chemical attack. For its part, Russia has dismissed the all United States warning as just a provocation. But what has come as a huge embarrassment for the United States is an explosive report published by American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who has questioned the United States claims that Syria used chemical weapons earlier this year. The American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has questioned the Trump government's claim that Syria carried out a chemical attack on its people in April. In a signed article published by the German news site Die Welt, Hersh says that Trump was, and here we quote him, warned by the United States intelligence community that it had found no evidence that the Syrians had used chemical weapon, unquote. In more damning revelations, Mr. Hersh writes, and here again I quote him, the available intelligence made clear that the Syrians had targeted a jihadist meeting site on April the 4th using a Russian-supplied guided bomb equipped with the conventional explosives. Details of the attack, including information on its so-called high-value targets, had been provided by the Russians days in advance to American and allied military officials in Doha, whose mission is to coordinate all United States allied, Syrian and Russian Air Force operations in the region. Some American military and intelligence officials were especially distressed by the president's determination to ignore the evidence, end quote. The investigative reporter Hersh goes on to share more startling information. He cites one American official as telling colleagues that, and here we quote the American official, none of this makes any sense. We know that there was no chemical attack. The Russians are furious, claiming we have the real intelligence and know the truth, end quote. Mr. Hersh's reportage is reminiscent of the 2003 Iraqi war, when the United States used fake documents to claim that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, and it was used as an excuse to start the war. And if it is true that truth is the main victim of war, to understand more on this matter, I am now joined live by my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran, who has a very special guest, a Syrian lawyer and international relations expert, Mr. Zain Abbas, with him. Ramesh and Mr. Zain, thanks for joining me, I appreciate it. So, let's try to get it straight. Once again, Americans are saying that there is a possible chemical attack on the pipeline coming from Assad's forces. Is it a lie?
All right, thank you, Daniele. I have Zain Abbas with me, a lawyer, a Syrian lawyer and research scholar. Zain, I want to dive straight into this story we are following closely on WION. What do you make of the Seymour Hersh article in Die Welt news site? Does it nail America's lie?
Well, basically, to be honestly speaking, today we always hear such accusations only during the time when the Syrian army is making more achievements and victories against ISIS and terrorist groups, and recapturing lands which were under the control of these terrorist groups. So I think there is nothing new today from hearing such false accusations. But the questions that can be brought up here today is, what happened to the results of the last investigations that were made on the so-called chemical attack in Khan al-Asal and Al-Ghouta? And the second question that I would like to ask here today is, why have they rejected our proposal to send an investigation committee and investigate the area where they claim that the regime has used such chemical weapons?
Indeed, and the Hirsch article goes on to dwell a little bit on the white helmets and the questionable nature of the activity. Now, we know that there was a very important video which went viral on the social media about a young boy called Umran Daknish, who was shown sitting in an ambulance with blood dripping from his face. And that video, with the benefit of hindsight, turns out to be a fake video, part of the White Helmets propaganda. Now, what do we know about the White Helmets and their questionable activities inside Syria?
Well, if I would define today this organization, I would say it's an organization with a humanitarian form, but with a terrorist content. And the main purpose of this organization, which was created and funded by the state of Qatar, is to present false and fabricated materials to condemn the regime on humanitarian background. But so many videos have been leaked, and it has been proven that these groups are only present in the areas where, that are under the control of ISIS or other terrorist groups. So I don't think that today anyone would believe that this group is just for a humanitarian cause in Syria.
Indeed, and from all accounts, it seems to be a case of America using the weapons of mass destruction, or chemical weapons for that matter, to use it as an excuse to bomb a country, in this case Syria. Do you think it is similar to the 2003 incident when America used fake documents and intelligence to start the Iraq war, as it were, in 2003? You think this is a repeat of the same event?
Well, today we can't actually, or let's say no one can actually predict the future actions or policy of the United States, especially under the administration of Mr. Trump. But we don't trust their policy in the region. And I would like to say here that the scenario in Syria is completely different from the scenario of Iraq. First being that Syria has already gave up their chemical weapons in the year 2013 under the supervision of the United Nations. And second, I think our army or the country has already proved itself as strong during the war against terrorism, and especially when we have strong allies such as Russia and Iran in the region.
And Zain, for the viewers who might not be familiar with the situation obtaining in Syria today, or the history of the 7-year-old civil war, what would you say might be some of the US motivations for its intervention in Syria?
Well, today I would really like to mention a few of the motivations of the United States in the region. The first being is it aims to control and set up a military base in the borders between Syria and Iraq in order to block the cooperation line of Iran, Iraq, Syria and Lebanon. And second aim is to set up a safe zone area in order to fulfill the safety and security of the State of Israel, and to keep control over the Golan Heights, which is a territory known for its rich resources.
And we know that the US claimed that Syria had used chemical attacks, chemical weapons on the 4th of April, and that was used as an excuse for the 7th April US airstrikes on Syria. Now, we know that the attacks have indeed happened, but what about the timing of the attacks? Why now, when the Syrian forces are advancing or closing in on Raqqa, the de facto capital of the so-called Islamic State or Daesh? So what do you make of the timing of the US intervention, as it were, on the 7th of April? Why now?
Well, we can say that today it's very clear to us that the United States is not serious in the war against terrorism. And we have here to point out that if ISIS is defeated, then what reason the United States has to stay in the region? So I don't think it's in the interest of the United States to defeat ISIS at the moment. It still has to secure its interest in the region in Syria. And the second thing is, today the Syrian army is quite known in the world that it's fighting this terrorist groups, and not only on behalf of Syrians as well as on behalf of the world. So that's why we are here to say that the United States and its allies has failed and is still failing to defeat terrorist groups on ground in Syria, not like what the Syrian army and its allies are doing.
And Zain, as a young Syrian lawyer and research scholar, what do you make of, would you say or subscribe to this view or school of thought that Syria is a victim of the American propaganda or the war machinery, as it were?
Well, of course, I can say yes to your question. Yes, Syria was a victim of this propaganda, and the United States and its allies have used all of its resources and strength and power, including their allies in the region, such as Gulf countries, in order to overthrow the regime. and they have proclaimed that this is a war for democracy, but no, in fact, it's a war between people who want to have a secular country and between people who want to take us back to the old ages. It's a war between our government and terrorism.
And generally, Zain, what do you make of the American policy towards Syria on the one hand and the region in particular? Now, we know that the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had famously remarked a few months ago that removal of President Assad is not a priority for the Trump administration. We also heard the American ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, say that the people of Syria will decide for themselves the fate of Syria going forward. And immediately thereafter, we saw a flip-flop, as it were, by the Trump administration, and then we saw the attacks take place in Syria. So what do you make of the American position insofar as Syria on the one hand and the Middle East is on the other hand goes?
Well, there's no clear position right now for the United States. They keep changing their positions day-to-day basis. But what I can make out is that they still are not serious in this war. They don't know how to put an end, and they don't want to admit that the war in Syria is a war against terrorism. Today, the United States administration cannot come up to the public and say, yes, we did a mistake in the region. It's not really possible. But we hope that they realize the mistake and admit it.
Indeed, and Zain, we also know that the ground forces are advancing, operations are taking place even as we speak. Can you share the current status of the Syrian Armed Forces operations near Raqqa?
Well, see, this is basically the main reason why we see threats now made by the United States to Syria, because our army is achieving more victories. Recently, 10 days back, we have reached the borders with Iraq, and last week we reached the border with Jordan. And that is a clear signal to the West that yes, the Syrian army is going to win and the victory is coming really soon. The situation in Raqqa is a little bit complicated because till now there is no green light or signal from the United States. Our army is on the borders of Raqqa. Once we see, yes, there's a real cooperation between us and the United States, we will surely free Raqqa and end ISIS very soon.
And Zain, President Assad in his interview to WION recently said that, well, he's open for dialogue with anyone, including the US and President Donald Trump, but he fears that the American deep state may not allow dialogue to happen or reconciliation to happen between Syria and the US. Your thoughts?
Well, I completely agree with Mr. Assad, our president, on this point, because we have asked since the beginning of this crisis for open discussions and dialogue and to go for a peaceful solution, which India keeps on saying. And that's what Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister of India, has said earlier, that yes, there only could be a peaceful solution in the region. But we have not seen any agreement or resolution between us and the United States on this matter.
Indeed. And very briefly, Zain, you're a lawyer, you've studied law. Now, question to you is the following. What business does the US have to be in Syria today? We know the Russians are there at the invitation of the Syrian government, but what about the US?
Well, let me tell you today the difference. Russia came within the request of our government, the Syrian government, so that's totally legal. But the United States had to interfere directly without any request made by us in order to protect their tools on the ground. Today, the United States actually supports many armed groups in Syria in order to achieve their interest. And that's why they had to come directly in this war. They were not able to fulfill this interest using their tools in the region, so they had to directly interfere in this war in Syria.
All right, that was very candid of you, and to speak with such candor, Zain. Danieli, that was Zain Abbas, a Syrian lawyer and research scholar. I'm told you also would like to ask him a few questions.
Yes, exactly. If possible, I would like to ask one precise question. So, Mr. Abbas, you say that the United States are currently perpetrating their interest in the region, which I think is very much a correct thing. But what about Russia and Iran? You didn't mention them. It's like they are helping Syria out of generosity. Is it what you're saying? So Russia and Iran have no geopolitical interest in helping Syria?
Would you please?
Well, Zain, Danieli in the studio is asking you, what about Russia and Iran's role in Syria? Are they doing it out of generosity, or is it more geopolitical in nature?
Well, basically, Russia has made it very clear that they don't support the intervention in the sovereignty of any state, and that's according to the international law. Second, Iran has always been a close ally to the Syrian government and to our people, because we have a high-level cooperation between both countries. Yes, they have joined this war with us against terrorism, of course, in order to not only protect their interests, but also to protect the interests of the world. Today, this terrorist wave is not only in the region, it's spreading all over, and we can see the consequences in Europe countries too. So I think the Russian government and Iranian government realized this, and they had to interfere in order to put an end to this worldwide threat.
If I may ask another question, so basically as a Syrian citizen, as a Syrian analyst, you're saying that you're not afraid that Russia and Iran, if and when the war will be over and perhaps Assad will win it, they will not ask anything back from Syria for their help.
Right,
you're
so
not
Daniele
afraid.
also wants to ask a follow-up question. As a Syrian national, do you think Russia and Iran will ask for a pound of flesh, as it were, like a quid pro quo, in return for doing Syria a favor by standing up with the US? Would they expect Syria to expect anything in return, actually?
Well, to be frankly speaking, our president yesterday gave a statement that the Russian has stood with our government side by side, the same way a brother would do to his brother. So whatever in return the Russians and Iranians would ask, we are ready to support. See, when we needed help, they were the one who stood by us, and they are the one who supported us in this war. Of course, whatever they would ask, we would actually join them.
Another question I have, so basically, again, we're saying that perhaps the United States are lying. So my question to you is, why do you think that these air base we're talking about is so interesting for the Americans? Is that because the air base we're talking about is from where part of the operations of Russians start? They have helicopters there. Do you think that actually this is all about reconquering that air base and nothing has to do with the chemical attacks?
Another question, Zain, what could be the motivation for the Americans to target the Shiraz air base in particular on the 7th of April? Is it because most of the flights and aircraft take off from that air base to targeting the ISIS?
Yes, of course, that was the main reason. First, this is the main reason that they wanted to stop these airstrikes which were made by our army against ISIS. And the second reason was they wanted to send a direct message to our government that there are red lines which you should not cross. But we gave them a response on the same date that we started airstrikes from the same airport that was attacked by the United States strikes. So our message was very clear. We know what we are doing, and we are always going to fight against terrorism until we end ISIS and their brothers in the region.
All right, on that note, Zain Abbas, thank you so much for speaking to WION. Over to you, Daniele.
Thank you very much. My colleague Ramesh Ramachandran, correspondent, and also our special guest Zain Abbas, political analyst and lawyer from Syria. On this note, it's all we have. Thanks for watching, but remain with us for more news throughout the evening. Thank you.